Everybody see my first slide? Thumbs up if you can see that. Okay. So I'm Alison Zak, founder and director of Human-Beaver Coexistence Fund. From now on, I'm going to just call it HBCF, which is our acronym, and it's easier to say. And just, it was a great introduction, so we covered most of this, but basically I became a beaver believer back in 2018 when I was working at a nature preserve that just had a pair of resident beavers, and I started to learn all about them, and then realized that kind of the experiences that I'd had with other types of human-wildlife conflict could be of use to the beaver situation here in the Mid-Atlantic. And so the Human-Beaver Coexistence Fund was founded in June of 2021. So we are just barely more than a year old. Pop quiz. So actually I'm gonna, darn, you know what? I don't think I can read the chat from screen share, but if you do want to pop a guess into the chat, this is a quick question: which animal is the beaver? Just type the letter that you think is the beaver into the chat. And Bronwyn, if you want to like share, yeah, perfect. Oh wait,
we have a lot of guesses. We have a lot of guesses for A.
I can see the chat. I figured it out.
A.
Any other guesses? D, okay. I'll give like 5 more seconds. Get your guesses in. So these are all of the animals that people confuse with beavers when I am talking to landowners or talking to people at events. The correct answer is actually none of these. It was a trick question. I include this slide again to show all of the animals that get confused with beavers. And so I'll quickly run through and kind of reveal what each of them are. A is a nutria, which is a non-native species here in North America. Looks a lot like the beaver, but the giveaway are those long white whiskers. So I even have a book about beavers that has a picture of the nutria on the cover, which is pretty wild. But if you're ever trying to tell them apart, the whiskers are the giveaway there. B is a mountain beaver, which is not actually a beaver, and they only live out west. Not very well-known animal. C is a groundhog. D is a muskrat. So also a good guess for who the beaver is. I cut off the tail there on purpose so that you couldn't see, but an animal smaller than a beaver, but often found in the same types of habitats. And E, of course, is a platypus. That's mostly a comparison I get working with kids. And then, of course, F is a river otter. So just to talk about all the things a beaver is not before we really dive in. Pun intended. All right. Oops. No mice. Okay. So we're just going to review some beaver basics before we get more into kind of why beavers matter and how we can coexist with them. You can see from the range map here that beavers pretty much occupy most of North America, and their Latin name is Castor canadensis. They are in the rodent family, and they live in social groups of between 2 and 10 individuals. That is ideally a mated pair, a male and a female, and then potentially up to 2 generations, sometimes maybe even 3, in the same family group. I think the average number of beavers that you'll find in any given kind of pond complex is about 5 beavers. They are very well adapted for semi-aquatic life. And so you can tell by my fun kind of unscience and animal picture here, pointing out all of those adaptations that make beavers so well suited for living near and in very often the water. They live about 10 to 20 years in the wild. And here in the Mid-Atlantic in Maryland, the main predators, other than humans, to the beavers are going to be coyotes, bobcats, black bears, and then for the young beavers, which are called kits, sometimes larger raptors can take them from the water when they're learning to swim as well. Another myth that I'm constantly busting about beavers is that they eat fish. So beavers are in fact herbivores. They only eat plants. But contrary to what a lot of people think, that they're just eating wood and bark, they eat over 80 species of vegetation and lots of different plant parts, certainly not just the inner bark, which is why we think of them chewing down trees. And then finally, the thing that most people know about beavers also is that they build dams and lodges. These are two different structures that, again, even the adults that I talk to don't always know the difference between. Of course, the lodge is the structure that the beavers live inside of. It's their home. And then the dams are what they build to create the ponds where they feel safe swimming around and floating branches and escaping land predators by diving into the water. And a little caveat here is that we so heavily associate beavers with these two structures that they build, but they don't always build either one. So there are, in our larger rivers here in this area, some beavers that never have to build a dam because the water in the river is deep enough for them, because the only reason they're creating ponds is to deepen the water so that they can swim around and be safe. And sometimes those river beavers are not building lodges either. They will be building bank dens or just kind of digging out into the riverbank and little burrows that they can use. And so even though we associate beavers so much with building, I also like to remind people that they only build when they need to, and they build for a purpose. And so we can think about kind of the habitat that we're finding beavers in, and then think about, well, do they need a dam? Do they need a lodge? And that sort of thing. So they don't want to waste their time and effort building these things for no reason, right? So, oh, I didn't say this at the beginning, but I will take questions at the end, I guess, if that's okay with everyone. If you do have one and you don't want to forget it, you can type it into the chat and then I can check that when we get to the end. So a quick beaver population timeline. So this is just to kind of contextualize the beaver population in our area today compared to historical kind of population trends. So way back, far before the fur trade, there were upwards of, some estimates say, 400 million beavers living in North America. There were not just the ancestors of Castor canadensis, which we still have today, but the skull in the top left corner of this slide is a skull from a species called Castoroides, which was a black bear-sized beaver that lived at the same time as Castor canadensis and only went extinct about 10,000 years ago. And they were said to have kind of fulfilled the ecological role of a hippo, this very large herbivore. And the skull looks honestly pretty similar to our modern day beavers. And then of course we had the fur trade, which began in the mid 1600s and carried on through the 1800s, at which point the beaver population was estimated to have plummeted to about 100,000 beavers total in North America. And of course, if you know anything about beavers, you know that they were hunted and trapped for their pelts. That's one of those adaptations that makes beavers so well adapted to the water. So they have kind of like a two-layer fur pelt with an underlayer that is kind of like fur down, which is keeping the beavers warm. And then you have the guard hairs, or that outer layer, which is keeping them waterproof. And so that fur felted really nicely into the top hats. You can see some of the designs here. And that's why beavers were pretty much almost removed from our continent. It took about 2 to 3 beaver pelts to make one of these hats. And beaver fur was so valuable at one point that it was even used as currency. Today, what we're looking at is a population, and this number is kind of disputed, and the real truth is we don't really know, and somewhere between 10 to 50 million beavers. I think I've heard like 50 million. I think I've heard between like 12 and 15 million maybe is the hot guess at this point. But why I show this slide is really to demonstrate how beavers populations are still rebounding from the fur trade. Now, of course, there is not as much available habitat due to development and the human population as there was pre-fur trade. But in most places, what we're seeing is that there is still lots of available habitat for beavers where there currently are none, and we could see their populations continue to grow. So that is kind of to contextualize beavers in our area and in our whole continent throughout history. So now we're going to dive into why beavers matter. And this is kind of to set up why it is worth it to try and coexist with live beavers instead of, for example, just lethally trapping them, which is still a go-to solution for a lot of people. So I break this down into 3 different categories of why they matter. The first one is maybe the least impactful if I had to rank them, and that's just their foraging behavior. So what this means is that when beavers are chewing down those trees and creating those stumps, for certain species that beavers really prefer, like willow and alder, those stumps actually resprout and continue to grow. And so that in that way, beaver foraging helps to promote plant growth. And then also, when beavers are foraging, especially when, let's say there's not a lot of trees very close to the pond, or they've lived there for so long that they've kind of exploited many of the larger trees close to the water's edge, beavers will actually build these canals, like you can see in the bottom photo. And there are these little, like perfectly beaver width little water highways that beavers can use to safely, again, swim to a place where there is more vegetation that they are foraging on, potentially float some of those larger branches back to their main pond. But those channels and canals actually provide little microhabitats for lots of fish and amphibian eggs and larvae. And I've seen a really cool video of a camera just going down underneath the water in one of them, and it's like teeming with life. So very cool. They're creating a little tiny microhabitat in that way for other species. The next category that I like to talk about are the beaver dams themselves. So again, these are the structures that beavers build out of mud and sticks, usually, although anything they can find, if we're being honest. They build them to create the pond. So the function of a beaver dam is to slow down and spread out water across the landscape. Again, the beaver's main goal in building the ponds, which is beneficial to themselves, is to have a water depth of at least 3 feet so that they can swim around and avoid land predators. And also, because they don't hibernate, they're active through the winter, they want a water depth that is going to prevent freezing all the way through. So that's the main reason why the beavers build the dams. What the dams do for us is they basically act like giant water filters. They help to filter sediment and pollutants. They slow down silt rushing down the streams and overall improve water quality. They also help with stream restoration by helping to regulate that water flow and again, slowing the water down so that erosion is not such an issue. They slow down the water in case of really heavy rains and larger floods. So I often like to say that beavers, while creating flooding on a small scale, they're actually helping to mitigate really damaging effects of flooding on a large scale. For example, if there's more developed areas downstream of these beaver complexes, it's slowing down the water during times of really heavy rains and flooding. And then finally, the ponds themselves are really important. So we just went over why they're important to beavers, but these ponds are basically storing water. And so they're helping to replenish the aquifer, elevate or stabilize the water table. And essentially what they're doing is drought proofing the landscape in this way. They're encouraging more plant growth along the water's edge. They're useful even for storing groundwater that's used for agriculture. And then, of course, these ponds are places of increased biodiversity, and basically beavers are creating habitat for lots of other species, some of which are threatened or endangered or economically valued to us as humans. So a picture is worth 1,000 words, right? All of those slides just had so many words on them. I like to show a few pictures to really demonstrate what I've just explained. So this is an example from Nevada. Susie Creek. I've never been there, but from 1991, you can see on the left-hand side, you've got this really degraded, incised, heavily eroded stream, not a lot of vegetation along the banks, very dry looking landscape. And then beavers showed up in that same area. And then you can see a few years later, more like a decade later, how the beavers really changed that landscape. A lot more water, of course, a lot more greenery, and I'm sure a lot more biodiversity as well. This one I meant to take out, but it's great. I just always worry for time. This is just kind of an illustrated version of what we're saying with an added element here where, of course, on the left, you see a stream that is incised, what we would call degraded or in need of some restoration. And then what these little things are here, not actually beaver dams, but something called a beaver dam analog, which is a tool of beaver or stream restoration that's basically mimicking what beavers do. So humans build a dam, and it starts that process of slowing down the water, it's getting a little greener, and then the actual beavers show up here in this third panel, and they take over the work of what the humans have begun, and then they really start to get this wetland going and looking really healthy. So that's one of the ways that beavers are used for restoration. Finally, in this picture, we can see how beaver wetlands and their complexes of ponds are really useful during wildfires. And this is something that is less relevant here in our region, certainly out west, more of a hot topic, pun not intended that time, but some really exciting research going on. And so I do like to show this photo because this is from a wildfire in Idaho, where the fire kind of, it definitely hopped over the wetland there, but you can see how green and wet and lush that beaver wetland stayed, which helps the vegetation to recover faster after the wildfire. It provided a refuge for all the wildlife that was living on those slopes during the fire. They could come and have a safe place or refuge to kind of wait out the fire. And so you can just see how important these wetlands are, especially in the drier landscapes out west. All right, so now that we have established why beavers are important and why it is a worthy cause to coexist with them, how do we do that? Because admittedly, beavers cause problems. The two main problems that they cause are tree felling, tree chewing, like the picture on the left, and then flooding, like the picture on the right. Oftentimes beavers are attracted to a culvert that's going underneath a road. And if you think about being a beaver and seeing a culvert, it's kind of like a leak in a dam that's already built for them. And all they have to do is plug up that one little spot of the culvert and have themselves a nice little pond backing up there. So road floods are a very common problem. But also what I want to kind of stress on this slide is that often in our work with landowners, what we're seeing is that people will notice that beavers have returned to their property, and maybe they haven't been there in that person's lifetime or even in generations. And because the beavers have arrived, the landowner perceives that there is a problem. And so part of what my job is to do is to ask people kind of what the problem is, what is being damaged that they value, and is it, which is sometimes the case, that the landowner is just experiencing a change. And that can be unsettling for people because beavers change the landscape so fast. They're basically creating change overnight that no other animal other than ourselves can create. And so when we have kind of forgotten that these animals belong on our landscape, when they show back up and start changing everything really quickly, it can be, like I said, really unsettling for a landowner. But in reality, for some of the cases that we work with, their property, it's a little wetter, it's a little squishier, they've got a few trees coming down, but there's not necessarily a problem. So beavers teach us to embrace change. Now again, beavers definitely do cause problems. I'm not denying that at all. So when there is a problem, oh, this is just to share that we exist as an organization to help those landowners to address those problems and make available the information especially for the non-lethal solutions to addressing those issues. And we work in Virginia, West Virginia, Maryland, and DC. Our name, Human-Beaver Coexistence Fund, I do like to explain this. It kind of comes from the syntax of the term human-wildlife conflict or human-wildlife coexistence, but really, and it's not, oops, oh no, it is not like this little anamorph guy here, like a human beaver. People sometimes say, what's a human beaver? Ha ha ha. The reason why we have human in our name is because we really do value the landowners, what they value, what they're prioritizing on their own property. Whatever their concern is our concern, and we respect whatever decision they make about beaver management on their property. So we are, I like to say, we're not anti-trapping, we're not like beaver welfare only, but we're looking at this whole conflict from multiple perspectives holistically, because that's the way we believe everyone is going to be the most successful and happy in the end. So I just like to throw that out there. So really quickly, this is a little chart that I made for the state of Virginia, but I am 90% sure that it applies in Maryland as well. For each of the problems, and I know this is a boring slide, but stick with me. For each of the two problems, tree chewing and flooding, you can see on the left-hand side, all the potential solutions or ways to address that issue. And then we have what's the word, evaluated each of those solutions based on certain things like, is it legal, is it humane, is it effective, short-term, long-term, and is it affordable? And so what you can see from this is that there are really two solutions that can check all of these boxes, and they are both non-lethal management strategies that we recommend at HBCF. And so I'm going to dive into those two green ones next. We can always come back to this if you have questions. I know it's kind of a lot to read quickly. So we recommend protecting trees with this fencing material that you can find at the garden center of most home improvement type stores. It's 14 gauge welded wire, 4 feet tall, especially if you live in a place where there could be a foot or so of snow. And we recommend securing around the perimeter at the base of the cage and making sure that the seam is secure. Another key factor here is to leave at least 6 inches, but hopefully more like a foot between the trunk of the tree and the fencing material all the way around, because that is what makes this solution last for years and years and years. You do this once and this tree is protected for a very long time, as long as you do it the correct way. And we've seen it done a lot of incorrect ways. The picture on the bottom left here is one example of what not to do. You can see how the beavers have literally just chewed through those, the holes in the fencing because it's wrapped too close to the tree. Flow devices are the second strategy, and this is what I get really excited about because this is what we can use to address flooding issues. And I'm not going to get too nerdy into all the details here, but a flow device is the umbrella term that we use for all of the things that are going to help people to lower and control the water level of the body of water, but allow beavers to keep living there and doing what beavers do. You may have heard them called beaver deceivers or Castor masters, or there's the clumps and pond leveler. There are so many different names for these flow devices, but they kind of break down into two main types. The one on the left is the culvert protector. So we can see here how there's a culvert right here, probably usually a road right here. And the really cool thing about this trapezoidal design of the culvert protector is that beavers can build all along both of these sides of the fence. As they do so, they're getting farther and farther away from that stimulus of running water, flowing water, the sound of water moving actually through the culvert. By the time they get all the way over here to build, they've likely given up and then water is still flowing through this side of the fence. So that's how that one works. And then the pond leveler is something that can be used, and this was a picture taken the day it was actually installed. So the water level is super low. Normally you don't actually see the pipe part. That part is underwater, because the idea here is that you're caging off the culvert and you're caging off an intake to that pipe way over here, so that even if beavers build all along this fence, which they will do because they'll hear the water moving through, water will still be flowing. You can control the water level that way. This pond leveler design can also go straight through an actual beaver dam. So if you're not dealing with like a human-made culvert, you can even on kind of a beaver-made pond just destroy a little notch into the dam to control the water level, put that pipe right through it, and then keep it at a level that's happy for you as the landowner or land manager. So that's a very quick overview of flow devices. DIY, I'm going to briefly say that this is something that can get tricky because there are people and companies, unfortunately not too many in our area, that people have been installing these devices, designing them for decades, and they are professionals at this, and they are still learning new things every time because every site is different. So we do encourage people to take a DIY approach if they're up for it, because they're relatively easy to find materials, relatively inexpensive, something that if you've got a little bit of experience, you can throw one of these things together. But we like to manage the landowner's expectations in that case. It's going to be a process of trial and error. You're not going to make the perfect flow device on the very first try. And how we see that being harmful to kind of the overall coexistence cause is when a landowner installs a flow device, it doesn't work, and then they start telling people that no flow devices work. And so that's why we caution people against the DIY approach by just managing expectations, but saying, yeah, give it a try if you're up for it. There is also a program, the Beaver Institute. The Beaver Institute is a national nonprofit based in Connecticut, I believe, that offers a program to train people exactly to do this work with the flow devices. I am about halfway through the program myself right now, so it's a great experience. If it's something you're really interested in, this program is really great. And hopefully, eventually, the goal of this program is to get more people with the experience and with that very specialized knowledge installing flow devices that are going to work well for people. If you don't have a beaver problem, lucky you can still help the cause of beaver coexistence. You can learn about beaver behavior and their benefits and share that information with others. You all are doing that just by being on this Zoom call, which is very exciting. These are some of my favorite beaver books. If you are inspired by this talk and you would like to learn more, if you're going to pick one out of any, I would say Eager by Ben Goldfarb. This one actually, Beaverland, is not even out until next month, so you could pre-order that one and be one of the first to check it out. But another thing that we can do is to reframe the way that we think about beaver problems. So I often like to share with people that I am a contradiction in my work with beaver coexistence, because I use the term beaver problem in order to find the people who need our services and need our resources and support. But then I turn around and I say, let's not use terms like beaver problems because of all these benefits that they provide. And that's just part of the fun of human-wildlife conflict and coexistence. We can also consider the language that we use to talk about beavers when we say things like nuisance and pest. Of course, these are terms with negative connotations that don't suggest that beavers provide any sort of benefit for us, not to mention the fact that they are inherently valuable just for being their beaver selves, right? And then finally, you can become a beaver community scientist. I bet some of you in this audience are maybe on iNaturalist. Maybe you put out camera traps and you share that information as a community scientist. And so one way that you can do that is by using an app called iBeaver, which is It's developed by actually one of our board members, Dr. Aaron Hall. He's at Defenders of Wildlife out in the Rocky Mountain region. And he and his team developed an app that is basically, it's like iNaturalist only for beavers. And it's very user-friendly. You don't have to know anything about beavers to use it. But if you think you've seen evidence of beavers, you bring up this app and report what you have seen, what you've observed. You can even include pictures. And then those data go into this program called Castor Mapper, which shows all over North America where beavers have been observed since the development of this app, which is very cool. Just a quick note, if you are actually trying to use Castor Mapper to find beavers to go look at, the data are abstracted to a certain level, and actually the user can kind of choose that themselves, just to prevent trappers or other people with maybe less than beaver believing intentions using the app. So that is a really cool resource that you can explore and hopefully even use when you encounter some beaver activity out in your hiking and exploring. And then just really briefly, ways that you can support HBCF if you are excited by the work that we're doing. I will be beginning a project soon on human perceptions of beavers in the Mid-Atlantic region. So if you have beavers on your property or you know someone who does, whether you're happy about it or mad about it or anything in between, I would love to talk to you. You can also check out our website to make a donation or to sign up for our newsletter so that you stay up to date with what's going on. If you go to www.coexistwithbeavers, and that will be on the last slide, you can just scroll down and then a little pop-up will come up for you to enter your email for our newsletter. We also have an Etsy store as a fundraiser where we sell beaver art with beaver chewed wood and things. So that's a fun thing. And you can follow us on social media. We're on Facebook and Instagram at Coexist with Beavers. And then this is my personal email. So if you have any questions about anything we've talked about here that I don't answer, or you want to get in touch, that is my email. And yeah, I'm going to pull up the chat, I guess, and see if there's any questions.
Allison, that was wonderful. Can you unshare? We'll come back together and we'll do questions and answers.
Sure.
And I'll help you with.
Yes, and I'll just put my email in the chat here just so everyone still has that.
Perfect. We had a general question. Ann and Dave said, do beavers live in brackish water ever?
They do, yes. There are a very small subset of the beaver population that are called saltwater beavers. Definitely they can be found in brackish water as well. There is kind of a limitation to them being in too much salt. Like I know off the Northwest coast, they've studied some beavers who actually died of like saline, I forget what they call it, saline poisoning, basically. But they can tolerate it to a certain extent, and beavers do kind of swim out into brackish or even salt water in some parts of the country. Okay. Great question.
If you have a question for Allison, you can raise your hand. I'll call on you. You can unmute or you can put it into the chat box. And when you mentioned that, are people still actively trapping and catching or using beavers for different purposes?
Yeah, so beaver trapping at this point is largely only in like nuisance contexts because the beavers are causing a problem. There are probably few people still trapping for the pelts, but they're not worth very much money. So that's not a big market at the moment. And recently, yeah, most of the trapping nowadays is just when a beaver is causing a problem.
And Judith mentioned there's a beaver dam road in Baltimore County. I'm sure there's a lot of beaver dam this, beaver dam that all over. And she wanted to know if we know why and how it got its name. So if anybody out there knows, you put that in, but maybe you, Allison, know that if that's a pretty common thing, naming Institute.
Yeah, I see it so often, and I know that I notice it more now because, you know, I'm the beaver lady, is what people call me. But I think it's in the book Once They Were Hats by Frances Backhouse. Don't quote me on that, but one of the beaver books I've read, they actually like look for all of the places like in the US that have beaver in the name, and it is a lot. I wish I could remember exactly where I saw that, but someone has asked this question before.
All right. And if there's a, I don't know, I don't know, do they ever trap the beavers for a part of their body that makes artificial strawberry flavoring?
Yes, again, that is not really the practice anymore, but the castoreum that they produce, I've heard mostly that it was in like vanilla flavoring, but maybe strawberry too. I wouldn't be surprised. Yeah, but what beavers are mostly using that substance for is for scent marking, actually. So a social group of beavers is relatively territorial. So they kind of establish their little pond complex, and they don't want any other kind of mated pairs of beavers coming into their territory. So they build up little scent mounds out of mud, and then they squirt, for lack of a better word, the castoreum substance onto the scent piles to advertise to the other beavers, like, hey, this is my territory. It's also, fun fact, a way that you can sex a beaver. So out west, you may have seen on that slide with the tables, there are beaver relocation is not an option here on most of the East Coast, honestly, because of just the more development, less habitat, less available habitat. But out west, when they're relocating beavers, when they're live trapping them, they want to know what sex the beaver is. They expel, that's the word I want. They expel some of the castoreum and they smell it, and then they know if it's a male or a female beaver. Very fun fact. I don't remember what it smells like. One of them smells like motor oil and one of them smells like cheese or something weird like that. Some people get a little grossed out. I would love to smell it someday.
And that's somebody's job.
Yeah, that's one of the things they do when they're live trapping. If you read Eager, he writes about it in that book.
Okay, I was interested in that why those two, why just letting beavers go wild in your table was not a long-term solution, or cutting down. I mean, doesn't come to a point of natural stabilization, or why is that not a long-term solution?
Do you mean just like letting them chew down the trees? Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that some people chuckle when I even put that in there as an option, because as you can imagine, just many landowners, that is not an option. They are attached to their trees and they don't want them all chewed down. But beavers will, it's not like super common, but they will eventually, potentially, depending on their habitat, kind of exploit an area to the point where they might need to move and find a different habitat. You know, especially in my work out here in like Northern Virginia, the more western counties, I'm seeing a lot of beavers on old farmland, even some active farmland where there aren't a lot of trees. And so in that case, you know, beavers can survive longer than we would think, because, you know, they're eating lots of other vegetation again. And as long as if they don't need a huge food cache for the winter, as long as their pond is deep enough to be able to survive the winter, they can spend a good few years on a property with few trees. But yeah, sometimes they do. Sometimes beavers will be in the same spot for many generations, decades even. And a lot of those tree species, again, are kind of like resprouting, regenerating, but not always. And so it's not unheard of for beavers to kind of exploit their habitat and then move to a new place. But it's not as common as some people would believe or have you believe. I've kind of heard that blown out of proportion.
And how receptive have landowners been to these new strategies?
It's been really great so far. So I didn't really mention exactly the services that HBCF offers. We do free consultations. So depending if you're within a certain radius, we'll do like a actual site visit and look at the situation together and talk about options. We also offer a cost share program. So if landowners are in need of financial support or financial incentives to try out a non-lethal strategy, we do have a cost share fund, which we can reimburse landowners for up to 50% of the cost of a flow device installation or a tree protection project. But largely the response has been really positive. I just think that people want to do it non-lethally if they can, and a lot of people just aren't even aware that these are effective ways of managing these problems yet. And so another big piece of what we do is the education. So that's why I do talks like these. We do beaver school programs with kids, and really, half of what we want to accomplish is just letting people know that these are options and giving them the resources they need to pursue them. So people are usually happy to know that they don't need to trap the beavers, which is great.
So Turk asks, in addition to alders and willows, are there any other tree species they target? And I guess it's the opposite of that. Are there any trees that they don't target?
Yes, very good questions that I get very often. Other tree species that they target that they really like are going to be like poplar, maple, beech, aspen. I do kind of like to answer that by giving you what beavers don't prefer or don't like, and that's pretty much nothing in my experience. Some people will say that beavers don't like conifers, or like they'll not chew down conifers, but I have seen them chewing down pine trees. There's kind of not much a beaver doesn't like is my really general answer to that. And people do, beavers live in a variety of habitats, and they even have individual preferences. So depending on kind of where you are, you might notice certain preferences that are totally different in another place, but they're not very picky creatures. Let's just say that. Good question.
Have there been any cases of people who if you want a beaver on your property, how do I get one?
Great question. There are people who want beavers. I would say for every 2 people with a problem, I get one who's like, hey, I want beavers, but I don't have them. I'm keeping a list of all those people. I have dreams of somehow making like a online dating for beaver matching up with property type situations. But again, because relocation is not legal here in this region, that is tricky. So the way that you can try to attract beavers naturally, if you want them on your property, of course, I hope you have water. You can plant the species that beavers really do like. So willow is going to be the #1 thing that I would recommend for that purpose. And you can, so you saw the little tiny picture of those beaver dam analogs, or those kind of human-made dams that are used for restoration purposes. But sometimes I recommend that for people who, if we know that there is a population there's another family group somewhere nearby, that beavers might naturally disperse there and find that habitat, especially if they make it more appealing by getting the dam process like kick-started. So you can build your own little dams in the stream, and then hope that a naturally dispersing beaver will come along and take over your work. If you just start slowing down the water and planting the foods that they like, and then hope for the best.
Well, Turk follows up with, how far would a beaver travel to get to a tree?
Yeah. So a lot of people think, and this is another important factor when you are deciding what trees to protect. So if you're wrapping, because wrapping individual trees is pretty tedious. You've got to kind of prioritize the ones that you really want to protect and do those first. A lot of people are surprised how far from the water beavers will actually go. And so the number that I've read most recently is up to 60 meters away from the water is how far they'll travel. That's how far they'll feel comfortable kind of leaving the safety of the pond. But beavers do also, when they're dispersing from their kind of like home lodges, they can actually travel like 50 kilometers and maybe more than that to find new habitat once they've hit the 2-year mark and they're looking for habitat of their own. So they really can travel overland farther than we think once we see how awkward they waddle around. They are pretty vulnerable, but they do have to travel some distance to find habitat and sometimes to find those nice big trees. So.
And Jean asks how large a pond is necessary for a pair of beavers to share with a second pair.
Oh, they would never share an individual pond. So one pair of beavers actually usually builds multiple, like a little complex of ponds. I've also read that on a mile of stream, let's say, if we think about it in like stream distance instead of like individual ponds, there could be between 1 and 3 pairs of beavers living on a mile of stream. But as far as like an individual pond goes, they're not going to tolerate another pair in their pond. So if they've built the dam and they've established their lodge or their bank den, they're probably scent marking around there, and they're not going to let another pair come into that exact area.
Interesting. Okay. Do we have any other questions for Alison right now while we have her? I know I have to go now and download iBeaver onto my phone and start putting that stuff in. And I hope
it's not an app that's called iBeaver. It's a little bit complicated. It's not complicated, but it's actually I'm forgetting the name of it. And I have my phone right here. It's a GIS app, but don't let that intimidate you. I'm trying to find it on my own. It's called Survey 123 is the name of the app that you download to actually access iBeaver. But what I recommend for everyone to start is if you just Google iBeaver, it will take you to a Defenders of Wildlife kind of info page about it. And then it'll have all the links and instructions that you need. So that's a good place to start.
For those, if we're getting into the fall season, is it easier or harder to see beavers as we're going into fall and winter? Do they go down and go away for the winter? Can we still see them?
Fall and winter are actually like prime beaver seasons. Fall, especially because fall is kind of actually the hot time for conflicts because beavers are preparing for the winter. And what that means is that they are trying to raise the water level even more than it probably was throughout the summer. Again, that's so that it's deep enough so it doesn't freeze. They are also cutting down extra trees that they're not going to eat until late into the winter. And so they're creating food caches, which are like little piles of sticks that they stick down in the mud near the entrance of their lodges or dens. And so there's like just a little more activity kind of across the board in the fall. And then I love watching beavers in winter too, because it's so much easier to see their stumps. They're not all overgrown with vegetation. You can pick out beaver activity so easily in winter. And then as long as you're out at a beaver pond and at dusk or dawn, that's the best time to actually see them. So.
That's great. And if you look on our calendar of events, we do have a beaver dam walk. A beaver walk scheduled with Bill Curtis, who's on this call right now. I think it's in November. but there are spaces available. You can go ahead and save the date and register right now. We hope to have some more coming up. Maybe we can get together with Alison and go out her way and do some more looking for beavers and become beaver. Well, I think we're all beaver believers now, if we weren't to begin with. So thank you, Alison, so much.
Thank
I
you.
encourage folks to go and follow you on Facebook and Instagram. I can't wait to go look at the Etsy store and get some beaver stuff. So it's been wonderful. Thank you for all that you do. And everybody, now that you're smarter, you got to go take this knowledge and give it to other people. Okay, that's your job. That's your homework for tonight. Thanks for joining us. I hope to see y'all next week. We're going to learn about the whale shark, and stay well, stay curious, and stay outside. Good night, everybody.
Good night, Alison.
Bye, Bill. I want to come to your beaver walk.
Okay.
I'm going to go on the website.